Hello and welcome to our second video in week one, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about the brain, orienting ourselves around the brain and some of the major regions of the brain as we see it. Now, before we actually talk about the brain itself, I just want to give you a very, very quick rundown, if you like, of the organization of the nervous system, so we know how the brain fits into all of this. So it provides you a little bit of context about how all of this works. So when we talk about the organization of the nervous system, we really are looking at a continuum, but we divide it into various components for ease of explanation. So we talk about the organization of the nervous system in terms of the CNS, the central nervous system, and the CNS, or the central nervous system, is the brain and the spinal cord that is connected to the brain. Now, from the lower regions of the brain, as well as from the spinal cord, there's a whole lot of nerves that go out to the rest of the body and a whole lot of nerves that come into the body, and this is called the PNS, or the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is composed of what is known as the afferent nervous system. The afferent nervous system is that component which is the sensory nervous system. That is, if I touch my hand, there's a sensory organs on the palm of my hand that pick up the touch, the pressure, the temperature, and send it through sensory nerves to my central nervous system, to my spine, and then eventually to my brain, and I make some sense of it. So this is the afferent, or the sensory nervous system. I'm making movements of my fingers, perhaps my palm, as a result of that sensation or voluntarily, and that's the efferent nervous system, the nervous system that goes from the brain and spinal cord out to the periphery. So this is the peripheral nervous system, afferent division and efferent division, or afferent component and efferent component of the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system has two major divisions. One that we call the somatic, and one that we call the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is the voluntary nervous system, and the somatic nervous system innervates or controls skeletal muscle. So all of the movements that I'm doing voluntarily, that is my fingers, my talking, the movement of my head, etc., etc., my facial features, these are all part of the somatic, all under somatic control, because it's moving skeletal muscle voluntarily. The other is the autonomic nervous system, and the autonomic nervous system is also the involuntary nervous system, and it doesn't control skeletal muscle, but it controls two other types of muscle, as well as some glands. The type of muscle that it controls we call cardiac, that's your heart, and smooth muscle. Often you find smooth muscle associated with the tubes of the body, such as your gastrointestinal tract, as well as your blood vessels, because they are tubes through which fluid flows, or food and other fluids together flow, and they are surrounded or controlled by smooth muscle. So it's your autonomic nervous system that controls heart, how fast your heart is beating, how hard your heart is beating. It's the autonomic nervous system that controls how a bolus of food that you've just swallowed moves through the gastrointestinal tract all the way from your esophagus to your anus. And there's very little thought process that goes into that. There's very little control that goes into that. It happens automatically or involuntarily. And this is the autonomic nervous system. It has two divisions. One that we call the sympathetic nervous system, and one that we call the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system seems to speed things up, whereas the parasympathetic nervous system slows things down. Taking heartbeat as an example, sympathetic activation increases heart rate. Parasympathetic decreases heart rate. When we look at sympathetic control of smooth muscle, in some blood vessels it dilates them, makes them more. So if you've got sympathetic, it's going to dilate blood vessels to your muscles so that they get more blood, more oxygen. It's going to dilate it to your brain, but it's going to constrict it to your gut. Why do you need your gut if you've got sympathetic activation or stress? Okay, you don't need to digest food, but you need to run, fight, or flight. You need muscles for that, and you need brain activity for that. So sympathetic tends to turn things up, increase, whereas parasympathetic tends to turn things down and decrease. Both of these, sympathetic and parasympathetic, also controls secretory glands, so the secretion of various enzymes, various hormones from things like your adrenal gland, etc., are all controlled by the autonomic nervous system. The other division is the enteric nervous system, which controls the gut. It's part of the autonomic nervous system, but it operates as a unit on its own and can be quite independent from the others. So it's a little brain on its own, as it were, that controls gut activity. So that gives you sort of a flow through how the nervous system is organized, from the central nervous system, the brain spinal cord, to the peripheral nervous system, those nerves that go out and those nerves that come in, and those nerves that go out can be somatic, can be autonomic, which controls voluntary or involuntary activities, as well as the somatic nervous system. But let's get back to why we're here, and that is to talk about this wonderful, wonderful organ, which is our brain. When you look at the brain, what you mainly see is this mass, which we call the encephalized brain. This is the modern brain, as opposed to the structures that are deep within, which is the ancient brain, and we'll talk more about that later. But a little bit of nomenclature, if you like. If you position the brain in this manner, where this is the front and this is the back, so I'm looking at it in this orientation, the front and the back. When we look at the front of the brain, this is what we call the anterior. So this is the anterior here. At the back here, this is the posterior. And then we have the top, which is the dorsal. Think of a shark with its dorsal fin, dorsal at the top, and the bottom is ventral. So anterior, posterior, dorsal, and ventral. And there are, so that's orientation, front, back, top, and bottom. And there are a number of sections that we can make, and you'll read about these if you look at MRI reports, etc., etc. You'll read of things like coronal sections. You can see there's a line there. I can take the front of that bit off, and we'll do so later on. But if I was to take a knife and cut it in that plane and look at the brain either that way or this way, but cut it in that plane, we call that a coronal section. Coronal section. And you can have coronal sections at the front, so anterior coronal, posterior coronal, etc., etc. We can have a section in this plane from front to back, slicing the brain across that way, and that's called a horizontal section. For obvious reasons, that's the horizontal plane. That's called the horizontal section. And then we can have sagittal sections. And sagittal section is from the front to the back, right through there. So let me just turn this around a little bit, and you'll see this large section through here, this large cut through here. And that's actually the mid-sagittal line. So it's a sagittal section, it's right in the middle, it's a mid-sagittal line. You can have a sagittal section towards the side, and that would be a lateral, because to the side is sagittal. In the middle is medial. If you're right in the middle, it's mid. Towards the middle, it's medial. Towards the sides, it's lateral. So you can have a lateral sagittal section, you can have a medial sagittal section, you can have your mid-sagittal section. So this is some of the nomenclature that's used in orienting yourself around the brain, and obviously you're going to be reading lots and lots of reports in your training as well as in your professional life, and this will give you some idea of the orientation. And some of these terms can be put together as we've done: mid-sagittal, lateral sagittal, etc. Towards the front of the brain, we have a number of cortexes in the brain. And just very, very quickly, we've got where my hand is to the front in that anterior section, and this is the frontal cortex, and this is the cortex where cognition, this is the cortex where decision making really happens. So that's the frontal cortex. At the back here, we have the occipital cortex to the back, the occipital cortex, and the occipital cortex is really the cortex that deals with vision, primary vision, as well as early interpretation of that vision. So the occipital cortex towards the back. Between the front and the back, so between the frontal and the occipital cortex, we have, where my hand is lying right now, the parietal cortex, and the parietal cortex is primarily concerned with the integration, the interpretation of information. So it will take information coming from the frontal, coming from the occipital, for example, as well as the lobes to the side, and it will interpret, it will integrate all of that information. Lying to the side on the lateral regions of the brain are the temporal cortex. And the temporal cortex contains, together with the parietal, a number of very, very important centers for speech, for listening, so audio centers, etc. But much more important for us is that it contains, particularly this little region that we see here, contains what we call the hippocampus, and the hippocampus is important for memory, in particular the formation of long-term memory. So it converts short-term, what we call short-term, to long-term memory. And if any damage, and we'll give you examples later on of individuals who've got damage to the temporal lobe, where memory is quite impaired. So frontal, occipital, parietal, temporal lobes, and you've just had some very, very, very quick functions of that. Okay, I'm going to leave it there for video 2, and we'll come back with video 3 and look more into the various areas of the brain and their functions. Thanks.